Welcome to another episode of Things You Didn't Know About the Holocaust. I'm Phyllis Zimbler Miller, and today I have with me Jordan Stevens Scher, who is the author of, we're going to call it an historical biography because it's really based on a true story, but he's just fudging a little by saying it's not exactly nonfiction. The book is called Dark Shadows Hover, and it is the story of Morris al-Habari as a young boy in is sort of Yugoslavia. Now I will explain that for 1 second, which was that Yugoslavia was formed after World War One, too complicated to go through its history now, and but to bring it up, and then now after many years later, it's no longer Yugoslavia again. But right now, we are focusing on the Holocaust story that Jordan has done a lot of investigation looking into and talking to the widow of Morris, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, take it away. Set us in the situation.
Okay. Thanks for having me, Phyllis. I really do appreciate being able to speak with you and your audience. Um, I've written a couple books about the war in Bosnia in the early 90s. And Bosniaks were Bosnian Muslims who were targeted by ultra-nationalist Serbs. I got very invested in trying to understand what happened in that war. And but it led me to think about what happened to Jews in the former Yugoslavia during World War II. And so I ended up doing a good deal of research, learning about it. And the Jews in the former Yugoslavia and prior were Ladino speaking. They were Sephardim. Now I'm Ashkenazi, and I know certainly a bit about because we're Eastern European Jews. But for the Sephardim, they left Spain during the Inquisition and Portugal during the 15th century because
Yes.
the Jews were.
1492, they had to be out by from Spain, and then a few years later from Portugal.
Mhm. And so they traversed Europe. There are many Sephardim, I don't know about many, but Sephardim in Turkey, and many ended up in Yugoslavia, that area of Yugoslavia. Now, these are Ladino speaking. Ladino is also called Judeo-Espanol. Um, the person I based my book on, Morris al-Bahari, is Sephardic, and his family is one of those that traversed through Europe, throughout 400 years and ending up in northwest Bosnia, where that is now. But I wanted to know what happened to Jews. And at the time, I knew there were Sephardim in Bosnia. Don't know a whole lot, or didn't know a whole lot about the Sephardim. Didn't know much about Ladino, but it was very important, and it developed throughout their travel, the Jews' exodus in a way. And in fact, Morris, I'd seen an interview, he considered his family, that was the second exodus for Jews. So he considered that, and I'd seen interviews with him. And so they developed this language that sort of was a hodgepodge of, certainly Spanish was very much the influence because with Spain, but Arabic, Aramaic, Hebrew, Italian, French, and it became known as Ladino. So the Jews in Yugoslavia, they were they were Sephardim, and they spoke Ladino. Yugoslavia after 1929 was called the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, and it had a monarchy. And there was certainly unrest, as there always is in that region. And this is not necessarily pertain to the Jews by any means, but there are many ethnicities in the former Yugoslavia, including Serbs, Croats, primarily Montenegrins. Okay. So between 1929 and the World War II in 1940-ish,
Okay, but it started in 1939.
it did, but it was around 1940 that the king, there was a king still for the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. In 1934, King Alexander from Yugoslavia was assassinated in Marseille, France, on a visit. He was assassinated by a terrorist organization called the Ustasha. And I'll get into talking about the Ustasha in just a minute, but they were Croatian. They're fascist. And their leader, a guy named Ante Pavlich, he formed the Ustasha in the late 20s, early 30s in Europe. And that group ended up assassinating King Alexander of Yugoslavia, who was just visiting, a state visit, whatever. So from that point, the Ustasha started to play a role in Yugoslav politics.
But
Okay,
there was still a king. I take it there was a
still a
successor
king.
king.
In fact, Alexander's son, King uh, Peter, was 11 at the time of his father's murder. He was too young to take over, obviously. So a cousin named uh, Paul, Prince Paul, was named regent until the young Peter was old enough to become king. But he never actually became king because, of course, in the 1930s, the Nazis were planning, Hitler was planning what would subsequently be their attempt to dominate Europe and the world. And so it was somewhere around 1940, actually, it was October of 39, where the Italians invaded Greece on behalf of the Germans.
Right. This is 1 month after the Nazis invaded Poland.
Right. And so they Italians, they were allies. Mussolini was allied with Hitler. And the Italians, wonderful people. My wife is from Italy. I love her beyond. We've been together 50 whatever years. Not militarily the most savvy. And they really struggled against Greece. So Hitler decided in 1941, prior to that, there was actually the Yugoslav government signed I think it's called the Tripartite
Yeah.
Pact with the Nazis and Hungarians and others that there would be no tension between them. However, that was mid-March or late March of 1941. I'll get back to the 1940 in a second, but 1941. And but a pro-ally government had a coup d'etat. They got rid of the existing Yugoslav government that had signed this pact with the Germans, and Hitler was furious. Um, so he essentially said, "I'm going to destroy the state of Yugoslavia." Prior to that, Yugoslavia was not of real interest to him. So the other thing is he sent his military into Greece to support the Italians because the Italians were not doing so well in Greece. So he invaded Greece and Yugoslavia. And when he invaded Yugoslavia, it was April 6, 1941. And he invaded Belgrade, the capital of Serbia. I remember Yugoslavia, even to this day, was made up of many countries, but it was considered Yugoslavia. So there's Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, Slovenia, and Macedonia. Okay. So Hitler invaded. Belgrade was pretty much the capital, it's where everything was happening. And the Nazis just destroyed, I think 17,000 people in the city were killed within a 10-day period. So Yugoslavia was subjugated in a sense in 10 days.
But
So
it had
then,
nothing to do with Jews at this point. It was just subjugated.
no, and that's the thing that the interesting thing is, well, it's not interesting, it's a horrific thing, is that um, more typically than not, until the Ustasha and the Nazis became very involved in Yugoslavia, Jews weren't necessarily a target. In fact, in the former Yugoslavia, there are, I think, 80,000 Jews prior to the war and around 80,000 Roma. Well, of course, Nazi doctrine was to target anyone non-Aryan. The Ustasha, remember under this his name was Ante Pavlich, were given control after the Nazis took over on April 17th. So it was a 10-day war essentially. And they put the Ustasha in charge of what Croatia, but they were now calling the independent state of Croatia. So, and that included Bosnia and Herzegovina. So you had independent state of Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and it was the Ustasha who oversaw that, but they did that in collaboration with the Germans and the Italians. And the Germans ended up partitioning different parts of Yugoslavia, giving the Italians like the Adriatic coast and other areas, the Ustasha, as I mentioned, independent state of Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, and other Bulgarians got a small portion.
Right.
And then there's sort of, but there was also another group called the Chetniks. So this is a very complicated war because the Chetniks were
Wait.
very,
Can I ask you a question? They have
yeah,
nothing to do with the Chechens and
the Chechens, no.
Chechens. Okay.
Chetniks were actually the names of the militias in the military during World War One in Serbia, when Serbia fought in World War One. They were the Chetniks actually in the 90s war, 1990s war, the Bosnians called the ultranational Serbs Chetniks because of their brutality. So you had this brutal Ustasha group, okay? You had this brutal Chetniks group who were, um, they did not like each other because the Ustasha wanted a Aryan Croatia and Yugoslavia, and the Chetniks wanted a pure Serbian, Orthodox Christian Serbia, Yugoslavia. So you have these factions, and and there's so many factions, and then so you had the Ustasha who they were now, this is where Jews were being targeted because the Ustasha were following Hitler's racial laws. Jews were wearing yellow stars. Jews were kicked out of school. This is in 19 when the Ustasha took over, 1941, April of 1941. Jews could not, kids were getting kicked out of school. They couldn't have business. Jews could not have businesses anymore. And it evolved pretty quickly into concentration camps in the independent state of Croatia. One of the biggest was called Jasenovats. And Jasenovats was a place of murder, essentially. And they didn't really use gas chambers necessarily. There were some, but they used almost primitive weaponry, axes, hammers, um, knives, some guns. They were horrible. And that's where many Jews were killed because Jews, of course, were not Aryan. And there were roughly in, and also the Orthodox Christian, remember the Catholic Croats did not want anything to do with Orthodox Christian Serbs. So they targeted Serbs, the Ustasha targeted Serbs, Jews, and Roma primarily, and communists, and people they thought were, um, anti them essentially. So these folks, sadly, there were many imprisoned in Jasenovats. There were many other. There were, I think, 5 total concentration camps connected to the Jasenovats system. And within a year or two, many, many Jews were murdered, and Roma and Serbs. In fact, with Serbs, ultimately, there were more because there were more Orthodox Christian Serbs. There were many more thousands of Orthodox Christian Serbs murdered in Jasenovats. But the Ustasha also sent, essentially, you'd say gangs. They were black shirts. That's what they were called. They wore black shirts. And they would wander the land and murder Serbs, Jews, and Roma. They had militias just going in and murdering. Now, all this, I've left out the biggest group, which is the partisans. And Josip Broz Tito, who was communist, and he was head of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, he was able, he's a brilliant tactician, brilliant politician, and he was able to form this from a small guerrilla force, partisans, which is the most successful, excuse me, resistance force in all of Europe. People look at the French, for example, or Polish resistance, and those things were amazing, but they did not have the magnitude or the magnificence of Tito's partisans. Tito's partisans crossed all ethnic lines. Remember, the Chetniks were Serb, and their goal actually, in fact, the Chetniks and the partisans ended up pretty soon after World War II started, engage in a civil war. because the Chetniks wanted a pure, ethnically pure Serbian country. Remember, the Croats wanted a fascist, you know, uh, country, and the partisans did want a communist, and ultimately became communist because the partisans won. But Tito's brand of communism did not include the Soviet Union. So it was very interesting. He was much more evolved in a lot of ways. But anyway, the Jews that were not murdered by the Nazis or Ustasha, many joined the partisans.
And they were
And
not,
so,
now wait, the
yeah,
partisans accepted them, right? As opposed to you were taking your chances when you, a Jew, when you joined the Polish resistance, whether they killed you or let you work with them.
for the most part, I will tell you now, Morris al-Bahari, this subject of my book, he was 11 when he escaped transport to Yasenovats. And it's a pretty fascinating story how he did that. And he was 12 when he was found by the partisans in the mountains. Morris was not, he held onto his Jewish identity. He hid his Jewish identity from his comrades because he didn't know. He knew
And
that they,
wait, the last name, his last name didn't give him away. Jews didn't have specific.
yes, in fact, what happened when he escaped transport, it was
Would you
very,
like to just briefly tell us that story or not?
yeah, it is fascinating because his former music teacher, okay, so Morris was from a little town called Drvar, Drvar in Bosnia. So he was expelled from school. And in fact, not interestingly, he came home one day and said to his father, "Who is Christ and why are the kids saying I killed him?" So he was expelled from school. And soon after, they were sent to what was called a collection camp. It was horrible conditions, certainly not like the concentration camps we know of. But from that point, he and his family were sent by train. They were going to Yasenovats. And on in one station, it's like 10 hours, a city called Prijedor. Morris, they get out because there was repair of the tracks. Morris's family, they're allowed to get out for a bit. And his former music teacher, who was an Ustasha soldier, saw him and called him over. And even though we don't know why he was Ustasha, he was forced into it, maybe his family was threatened, who knows? And he basically says to Morris, meet me here later. And I'm going to help you escape, essentially. And there's an Italian colonel who I'm friends with who's going to come here and take you back to Dervar. So he goes back to Dervar. It happens. It's pretty intense. And the colonel says, you need to change your name from Maris al-Bahari. So he takes on the name Milan Adamovich, which is a Serbian name. So he is Milan from that point. So when he meets up with the partisans, he's Milan. And then they actually give him a nickname. There are a lot of nicknames in the partisans. But he did not want to disclose his Jewish identity because he wasn't sure. Now, interestingly, there was a man named Moshe Pihada, who was one of Tito's right-hand men, who was Jewish. And he rose to the ranks of being in the leadership. So there were certainly Jews, and in fact, many who said they were Jewish, but I believe, based on Morris's experience, maybe also being a boy and his experience in his school, he just did not want to disclose that he was Jewish.
Okay. So now we have him joining the resistance at the age of what? 13?
12,
What?
12.
12? And so they let boys of 12 join the resistance, I take it.
I'm sorry.
And
What?
they let boys, they gave them guns.
Well, he did, but he was not expected to fight. He ended up what was very important. I'm sorry, you go ahead if you have a question
No,
because it
no,
may.
no. I'm listening. I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, yeah. So he was given a gun. He was very reticent to ever use it. But he was trained as a photographer and a courier, a messenger. And photography was incredibly important to the partisans because it was one way they put posters in villages, they'd send photographs, whatever. It was one way that they could recruit along not ethnic lines, but just the that we're a people's liberation movement. So Morris learned to take photographs. He'd never even owned a camera. And I remember seeing an interview of his through the Shoah Foundation from many years ago. And he said, they told us, they, meaning the government, they took all of their photographs. He said he had no idea where any of his were. And they put them, there were museums now in Belgrade and other places with these photographs. Um, but there was never credit given to him or most of the photographers. There were some famous photographers who did get that. But that was part of the sort of propaganda on the side of the partisans, because the Nazis had their own propaganda machine, as we know, through Goebbels and others. But that's one thing. Now, Morris also was a courier because they didn't have they didn't well they had later on there were some radios, what is it, some sort of radio system where they can connect with other units, but mostly it was messengers. And the situation, I don't know how Morris or really any of these messengers, they knew they're at risk of dying at any moment because they go out mostly alone. They can go 10, 5, 10, 15, 20 kilometers to give a message. But that was also very critical for the partisans to eventually defeat the Nazis and their collaborators. And Morris, again, was one of those. In fact, his nickname they gave him was called Machi, M-A-C-H-I, which means wildcat. He was smaller. He was he knew the mountains because he grew up near the mountains. So he just knew how to navigate. And so he never had, again, he didn't have to disclose or didn't disclose his Jewish identity. He was Machi at that point.
And then what happened?
Well, of course the Germans had much more in the way of military personnel and weaponry. Okay, and they actually there were many battles and many losses on both sides. Um, but the people's movement was so critical because it was for the people and in building the partisan military. But the Germans prosecuted 7 military offensives, they were called. And Morris was actually engaged in a couple of them. Um, and the Germans had, they had the Stuka.
Wait. You used the word prosecute.
I don't, maybe there was a wrong word, but maybe there are another words, probably another word, not prosecuted. They engaged in. Maybe that's a better way.
Engaged in. Okay, because
Seven,
it threw
thank
me
you.
off.
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry about that. Didn't mean to misuse a word, but
They
so yeah,
had 7 offensives.
7 German offensives, and they, involved, thousands and thousands of troops and warplanes and tanks and all of this stuff and parachutes. And the partisans, they for the first few years, couple years of the war, they fought alone. They didn't have allies. In fact, mostly the UK, the US eventually joined the UK, but most of the UK under Winston Churchill, they believed that the Chetniks actually represented the Yugoslav people because their king, who then was 17, King um, Peter, he was in exile in London.
Oh.
So he was telling them, they're saying, we're fighting the Nazis. Well, actually, intelligence ended up learning that the Chetniks were collaborating with the Nazis in order to defeat the partisans because they did not, Chetniks and partisans were in civil war. Well, eventually Churchill sent military officer of his, I think the guy's name was Fitzroy McLean. And Fitzroy McLean was a very wealthy family and went to the best schools and military school, and he hated communism. So it was interesting that Churchill picked him to go be with Tito. And he ended up learning the brilliance of Tito and learning that the Chetniks were actually the ones who were collaborating with the Nazis. So in 1943, the UK realized and they switched allegiance to the partisans. And they thought that Tito and the communists were better, much better for them than aligning with the Chetniks, right?
So now, we're coming near to the end of. So, what happens with Morris? Does he get discovered? And I take it that his family was wiped out.
I'm not giving any of that away. He did have a lot of family wiped out because they had many of his family, had come from originally from Spain, and so he had many. He on his mother and father's side, he had many relatives, and yes, many were wiped out. They were either Jasenovats or Auschwitz or other concentration camps. I don't want to give away the story, but I will. Obviously, Mars died in October of 2022. And he really lived a very fascinating life. He was a very interesting humanitarian. But there was also no question that the war trauma impacted his life in many positive and some maybe not so positive ways, I suppose. Um, but he survived the war.
When
Um,
he was liberated, when was he liberated? And by whom?
well, he wasn't liberated. He never made. He was not in a concentration camp.
No, no, but I mean, yes, I know, but I meant when was Yugoslavia
Oh,
liberated?
oh, oh. Well, when May 7th of 1945, when the Germans capitulated and they surrendered, that is about the time that Yugoslavia, and at that point, after the Italians changed sides in September of 1943, and the partisans got tons and tons of Italian military equipment, and that really turned the tide at that point. So now the partisans were really chasing down the Germans, and the Germans eventually uh, they fled through Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, and then you know the Germans signed the surrender in May 7, 1945. There was actually for a week after that, the Ustasha, who had been present in Sarajevo, they were in there was a unit that continued they went outside Sarajevo and they continued to fight, and the partisans ended up bringing in their air force to destroy this the final sort of battle with the Ustasha. That was May 15th, and that really ended it for them.
Wait,
And
wait.
then
The
Tito,
partisans had air support?
they did because eventually they had their own air force. The British gave them Spitfire and provided support by air, and the and so I don't know if I can't recall if they did it in unison with, or they had the Yugoslav. Actually, it's in my book. It's kind of interesting how the Air Force even began for the partisans in World War II. Is a pretty wild story, but yeah. So they ended up. It was a very vicious battle, and unfortunately, a lot more
So we're
partisans.
talking about when victory in Europe had already taken place. The Ustasha didn't care and they kept fighting.
They did one last time. So it was about a week after that that they finally succumbed. But and I apologize because and I don't necessarily need to elaborate, but these German offensives really caused a great deal of death and destruction. But the partisans still showed their strength, and the Germans couldn't defeat them, and that was very there were some battles, some of these battles that were so pivotal in the partisans now gaining the upper hand. And once the Allies, the US and the UK, joined the supported the partisans in 1943, um, the Germans were not able to sustain. I mean, but I will say there were in Yugoslavia itself, of the 80,000 Jews prior to the war, 14,000 survived.
And do you
And
know how many Roma survived?
about 14,000 also. They also had about 80,000.
And I noticed that you had said that they were about roughly the same.
Yeah,
And I do remember reading this one thing that Tito's partisans used to go up into the mountains where the Germans were not. It's the one thing I remember.
that's right.
So they had that advantage.
Not only that, they're expert mountain fighters, but the Spanish Civil War was in the mid to late
Yeah,
30s.
36 to 39.
Right. And many of them joined Tito's partisans. So they brought that sort of military knowledge and they could teach that to the
Mhm.
partisans. So it was one of the advantages. The other advantage, as I said, Tito's movement was a people's movement. It wasn't about specific ethnicity or religion. And that appealed to and ultimately resulted in the liberation of Yugoslavia.
And then it's sometime they broke up again, and we're not dealing with that.
We
It's-
won't, but you know what? Tito was Marshal Tito from 1946 to 1980 when he died, and kept things. Listen, he was pretty brutal too. They after the war, they chased down Ustasha, suspected Nazis, suspected fascists, and there were no fair trials. It was they executed many, many, or imprisoned many, many. Okay, but I've told you I have other books about Bosnian. People I've interviewed who lived during Tito's rule, they said it was, you couldn't practice religion openly, but people did, and they were not stopped from doing that. They thought that the socialist government of Tito's, and it was much more free in a way than the Soviet Union and the Soviet states. And and so after Tito died between 1980 and then the war in 92, tremendous unrest. And I won't get into that now,
yeah,
but
right. It's
it
that,
it extended from the weirdness is that, for example, for the Chetniks, the Serbs, whose goal from about mid 1800s was to create a greater Serbia. That's what they wanted. Well, that took hold again in World War II. That's the Chetniks. And then the war in the 90s, that was their goal again, to create this greater Serbia through ethnic cleansing, genocides, etc. So, history continued to repeat itself.
and Jordan and I agreed we weren't going to talk about today in any way. So we we can't bring you up to date. I'm just teasing a little bit, but Jordan, this has just been an amazing conversation. I do encourage people to read your book. I will include a link. You get one link, so you can choose a website or a link to Amazon, whichever you'd like. And I thank our listeners, and I do have to end by saying, and in this case, I'm gonna mean the Roma too, because I'll never forget something I saw at Dachau. My husband and I were stationed in Munich from 1970 to May 72 with the U.S. Army. And I was once at Dachau. We were there more than once. And I saw three, we called them gypsies in those days, three
Mhm.
Roma standing between the main, whatever it's called, and the crematorium. Two men and a woman. Never, ever, ever have I forgotten that vision. So I tried to include the Roma also, which is why I asked you that question, because I think they are in many cases forgotten. And I just thank you for explaining everything that you explained about the Sephardim. I have a very dear friend who's Spanish. He immigrated because of anti-Semitism in Turkey a few
Mhm.
years ago, who
Mhm.
can trace his lineage back to Spain. He speaks Ladino with his parents.
Mhm.
So I try again also to remind people that there are other Jews
That's right.
besides Ashkenazi Jews. Anyway, I thank you again.